And we are also going to put up on Facebook right now. And then we're going to listen to, then John has a issue.
Not an issue.
Not an issue. He has a question.
I need a rabbinical.
He needs. Okay. All right. We're streaming, but we want everyone to hear it. All right. Here we go. We're streaming. All right, one last thing. All right. Is that going to work? All right, let me see. That might work. No, we're still getting an echo. All right, Mike, you'll figure it out. All right, so we're going to start right now with John has a question, something he wants to bring up, something we want to hear. I hope.
So I've been coming to George City for a year and a half, and I don't think I've ever heard this discussed. What if Hitler never existed? No, hear me out. Hear me out. The Holocaust would never have happened. All the issues and the descendants would be here. Things would be created and cured and all that. That's fine. But would there be a state of Israel?
So everyone heard John's theoretical question. If there hadn't been a Holocaust, would there have been a land of Israel?
State.
Yeah, modern nation of Israel, the country of Israel. So there's different theories about that, and it's obviously it's a theoretical question. And it's one of those things you can never know, right? I got to figure out how to get this echo. Mike, don't go.
I'm going out. We'll give Mary a ride out.
So let me see how we do this. Elise, are you still there? We want to make sure we can hear you. Elise.
Yes, I'm still here and I can hear you sometimes with a big echo, but it doesn't matter as long as I can hear you.
All right, so we're gonna get off of. I just trying to figure out how to get off the echo. Give me 1 second.
Don't worry about it. I can still understand everything you're saying.
There'd be 6 million more Jews.
It'll be a lot more than that.
No, probably not. Because
All the descendants.
Hitler killed 6, leaving us with 12. How many are there today? 12. We haven't increased them.
So it's 14. There would have been the issue,
Okay.
the descendants, the issue of the parent. There would have been plenty. It would have spread.
Well, we're not too good at
Multiplying.
except for the Orthodox.
I just
They're all being
I just
there.
wanted to.
But that's
It's a good question.
I would think eventually there would be, but it might have taken longer.
All right, so let me ask you, John, what do you think the answer is? What do you think the answer is?
Based on what I know and based on what I've read, I do not think it would have happened in 48 because all the doors were closed. And no matter what anybody says, so I think in order for the state of Israel to have existed at that time, it needed that unfortunate event to occur.
So John says not likely, or at least not in 1948. Anybody else have any theories, thoughts on that? Philip, you're
Come on,
muted.
Wasserman, I know.
Philip,
I
Philip,
know-
Philip, you're muted, but you gotta say something.
Yeah, I do have a thought on it, and it's more of something that I remember from law school. If you read Brown versus Board of Education, you'll read, I don't remember which justice mentions it, but one of the justices in the unanimous decision, which it was, makes not direct, but indirect reference to why there had to be desegregation. And his reference is to what had just taken place in the fight against National Socialism and the Nazis and their racism. And so that sort of leads me to somewhat agree with John Stillman that but for the Nazis in World War II, would the Brown versus Board of Education decision been decided in that way? And we debated that in law school at Loyola. And I remember our professor, had the opinion that maybe not, maybe that Plessy versus Ferguson or some form of it might have existed longer. I don't know the answer, obviously, it's a hypothetical, but the justices in deciding Brown, we know were mindful of the Nazis and there was that in their minds.
Okay, so yeah, so your point is it might even go deeper, and you agree. I will say, I mean, my gut tells me that it might have played out differently. Yeah, but it's an interesting point that Philip adds, which is what did that experience do? You could also add to that the argument is that the World War II experience helped desegregate the army, which then helped desegregate the country. So there's that other level of the fact that even accelerated integration and assimilation.
That's not so true.
Well, I mean, I didn't make that up. That's
They didn't desegregate. Oh, no.
no, but they desegregated after World War II. That's when it started being
Yeah.
desegregated. So it accelerated the desegregation in our country. World War II kind of forced America to say, look, if we're going to have an army that's not integrated, how can we have an effective military force? And
But it wasn't for 20 until 20 years later. It was 20.
no, they started. I mean, they had by Korea, they had, I know, but by Korea, they had Black Air Force guys, and it was hard. I mean, look, I don't know. It was not integrated. So,
My point is,
yeah.
my question was, and I really.
And by the way, there was also an argument that World War II accelerated the assimilation of American Jews because it forced American Jews to come in contact with Gentiles, the children of the immigrants who came to this country. So the people who came here in 1900 to 1920, their kids, their sons, a lot of them, fought in World War II. And like my grandfather, that was the first time that my grandfather and a lot of other Jews came in contact with Gentiles. And so it accelerated the assimilation as people fought and died with Jews and Gentiles. It actually accelerated the integration and assimilation of American Jews. So there's that too. But I will say the one thing that you can make the argument was that Britain passed the Balfour Declaration, I think in 1927 or 27, around that time, 27 or 29. England basically said that they're favorably disposed to the creation of a Jewish homeland in the land of Palestine, in the land. So that was passed in the 1920s. The argument is that the gates to immigration really shut during the war, because the argument is that Britain needed Arab oil in order to win the war, and they didn't want to have the Arabs go over to the Nazi side, because the Arabs and the Nazis were pursuing relations. And remember, all of the Arab world was essentially, well, not all of it, but most of it was divided between the British and the French. The Vichy French side had gone to the Nazis to some extent, but that's not where the oil was. The oil was in Saudi, Iraq, and those British areas. And so Britain didn't want to exacerbate the problem by letting Jews come into Israel, into Palestine. So that's why Jews couldn't come in. I mean, there's also the argument they didn't want to tick off millions and millions of Arabs for the sake of a few Jews. But, look, I was reading Al Jazeera yesterday, because I was interested to see what they were starting to do for the 75th anniversary of Israel and what they call the Nakba, the catastrophe. So I was wondering what they were disseminating. And sure enough, they're telling their story. And, I went through it. I wanted to see what they said that was true and what they said, was not, and what they left out. Because there's three things. There's the truth, there's falsehoods, and then there's the omissions. And so it was interesting to go through and okay, well, you omitted what happened between 1948 or 49 and 1967, when all of that area could have become Palestinian, a Palestinian homeland, and you didn't do it, which is an answer where, when you stick that answer to the Palestinians or you stick it to the Arab world, they don't have an answer. There's no answer. There's no legitimate answer. So, look, I would only say the question of what the variables would have been for oil, what they would have been for geopolitical power between the Soviet, would the Soviet Union have emerged as powerful, would have created a bipolar world in the Cold War period, where America and the Soviet Union fought over the Arab world then, after it became independent, and we fought over, America kept, Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and we tried to keep Lebanon, and the Muslims, the Arab states that went over to Russia were Syria and Iraq, and then later on Iran. We had Iran too, right? So we kept that state for a while. So I don't know. I mean, so if there hadn't been the Nazis, would there have been a bipolar situation where we had Russia, the Soviet Union, and the United States fighting over the Arab world? And what would that have done to Israel? Because, that was part of the equation for the last 75 years, 50 of those years, 45 of those years, that Russian, or I keep saying Russian, but the Soviet US power struggle was a big part of that. We armed Israel, and they armed the Arabs. So,
Rabbi?
Yeah.
One of the things we learned on our trip to Israel was that the British created the Palmach, essentially, and they needed the Jews to help them, because to prevent the Germans, Rommel and the German army, from taking the oil fields. But right after the German army was defeated in I think it was the second battle of El Alamein, and they realized that wasn't going to be a threat anymore. Then they decided, well, we don't need the Palmach anymore. You're gone. You're disbanded. And then and then the Palmach essentially went underground.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is, as you say that, Philip, that is true. And everything you said is true. What's interesting is that Al Jazeera, when they were talking about the history of Israel, they said that. They said that the reason that Israel's army was so good was because it was trained by the British. Now, the British also trained the Royal Jordanian Army too, by the way. Okay? They were trained by Britain. King Hussein went to Sandhurst Academy. The King Hussein that was in power for a long time, right? So, it's not like they didn't have training and they didn't have armaments in their sphere. So yes, the Palestinians were not organized like that, but there were Arab countries that were organized and had a much larger military. So, again, that is true what you said, but to say that that's how that the Jews that were fighting from the Palmach, that what became the Israeli army was successful because of the British training, I don't buy that. And that, and
I didn't say that. I
no,
don't,
I know, but I mean, I'm saying that's what Al Jazeera says. And that's,
I don't buy it either.
but one of the things that we all know is that the reason that the Jewish fighters were so good was because they were fighting for their lives. They were fighting for their survival. So that's why, that's why, again, Al Jazeera is never going to say, and it was interesting how they said that, the Jews who established Israel wanted this land like it wasn't their land. The only thing that they said was the concept that this was the biblical land of the Jewish people. Not that there have always been Jewish people living there, not that everybody knows that this is the land of the Jewish people, but that this concept, as they called it, was that this was our homeland. So, and they threw out there on Al Jazeera that there were ideas that, that Uganda or that Argentina would be the Jewish homeland. That's all true. And the Jews kind of passed on that idea because we wanted to live in our ancestral homeland. So,
Rabbi?
yeah.
I sent you an email, I think, last week where there was a famous interview with President Nasser of Egypt right before the war broke out in 48, or maybe it was the 1950s, where they asked him what he was going to do with the Jewish people that he captured after he defeated Israel. This was under the assumption that Egypt would defeat Israel. And he looked at the interviewer and he said, I don't know what are you talking about? And the interviewer said, well, with the POWs and the women and children and the men, the older men, what are you going to do with them? And he looked at the interviewer and basically said, well, they're all going to be dead. I'm not going to do anything with them.
Yeah. So that's what we were, John. I mean, look, the issue is if the Jewish people had never been put in a situation where they had been the wholesale destruction of the Jewish people, would we have gotten a homeland as fast? The other issues there, the other issues of the other, what would the Soviet Union have looked like if the Nazis had never come into being?
Britain through the Ottoman, the 1914 Balfour was created, and that's what I was looking at. In other words, there was discussion 14, 15, 16, 17, then the war, right? 18, 19, 20, right? They had that pandemic, right? And then that stopped. And so the discussions from 20 to 33, right? Like I don't know much about this.
So that period is an interesting period, right? The period from the period between 20 and 40, let's say 41 or 39, even, when Poland was invaded. What was that 20-year period like in Israel? What was the trajectory of what immigration to Israel would have looked like? Look. The other thing that we don't talk about is the Nazis didn't develop in a vacuum, right? They didn't wake up in 1939 and Poland was invaded. You had the rise of anti-Semitism, through National Socialists and brown shirts in Germany. You also had similar fascist movements that were rising in Hungary and in Croatia and all these other places. So, what would have happened if Hitler hadn't won an election, or if those anti-Semitic movements were there, and would they have pushed Jews to immigrate at the same rates if there wasn't the power that the Nazis had? That's a difficult question. I don't know.
What did Weitzman and Samuel like? I don't know the history there. So I was just we were having dinner with the Watsons, and I said, I'm going to bring this up to Rowan. We don't need to go off, and we can pull this offline.
No, but it's
like, I haven't done any research even last night. What were they doing for those 10 years?
Look, there have been some Israeli scholars who've posited that and tried to figure out what would that have looked like. Most of the research hasn't been published, or it's not research, it's well, let's look at this and throw out this theory, really. Most of it hasn't been translated into English, so a lot of it hasn't. Some of the articles have been translated that have looked at it, but not the research, or not the papers themselves. Look, so what do the papers look at? They look at the immigration trends. They look at the political movements that were on the rise. One of the big things that isn't talked about is in 1929, there were what we call the Arab riots, and the Arab riots in Israel and Palestine under the British mandate. Hundreds of Jews were murdered by Palestinians. They were murdered in their homes, in their sleep. They were pogroms, and they were a response, not necessarily to. There wasn't really the Haganah had already kind of started in development as a, the early forms of the Israel forces of defense had already started, but was very loose at that time. Hashomar HaTa'ir, the guard, the kind of the national guard movement of Israel, Israelis defending themselves. But the riots actually caused lots of the Jews that were living in Israel at the time, in Palestine, to think twice about staying there. They were scared that there was not going to be any protection for them. Interestingly, the Al Jazeera site kind of referenced it, but didn't talk about it being wanton destruction of Jewish homes and Jewish life and Jewish property. They said that there was Arab attacks, but interestingly, they said what resulted in that was the roundup of thousands of Palestinians who were put in British prisons and British camps, which well, why? Well, because they were killing people, and the British did something. They arrested some of the people, but their take on it, the Al Jazeera take on it, was the British tried to destroy Palestinian nationalism by arresting the leaders of the Palestinian national movement. But if the Palestinian national movement was killing Jews, then there's your answer.
The Brits were on track, right? If you read the letters and all that in 17 to declare a Jewish homeland, right? Then World War I happened, and then it got sidetracked. But let's move on to numbers. We'll take this off.
No, but this is it's an interesting question, because we're coming up next week on the 15th. Next week will be that 75th anniversary. And I wanted to see and I tried to get a sense. I'm trying to get a sense of what you're going to hear next week. I try to get a sense of if there's going to be stuff. Well, we're definitely seeing some stuff right now, and I'll get to that in a second. But I was actually surprised at the lack of I don't think there's going to be a huge sense of support for the plight of the Palestinians necessarily here in America. Though there is one place in America, by the way, in America, where there's going to be a commemoration of what's called, again, the Nakba, which is the Palestinians 25 years ago, on the 50th anniversary, decided that the 15th of the month of May, the day that Israel declared its independence, would be their Nakba, their day of catastrophe. It's one of the great legacies of Yasser Arafat. So he decided every year we're going to call it the Nakba. They had already used the term Nakba, but this will be the date that we commemorate it, May 15th. So there will be a commemoration in America. Anyone want to guess where?
1600 Pennsylvania Avenue?
No, please. That would That would be not good. I would let you know if that was the case. No, it's not going in there.
I know.
No, where's it going on? Okay, I'll give you a clue. It's in New York.
Oh, in the Jewish area?
Williamsburg.
No. Nope. You're closer.
Harlem.
No, Glory was the closest with Times Square
Oh, Central
Ge-
Park.
geographically. You're closer.
What's the stick and deli we eat at?
It's not in a deli. It's in a really important building. It's not some random people that are doing it. No, that would be really offensive. Anybody? Thought someone would get it. Anybody online? Come on.
United Nations?
Who said that? David. David nailed it. The United Nations. Did you say it, Gloria? Did you say UN?
I said, no, not nine, where the nine.
No, yeah, I thought Gloria was gonna get close. I thought she said it. Yes, it was. David called it out. It was the United Nations. They are having a Nakba commemoration. Yep. Yep. Doesn't surprise you, right? But this is actually the first year they're doing it. Or at least they're doing it with speakers and music. What? Well, remember something, correct, but it said Abbas was addressing it, and I don't know if he's doing that by video or if he's actually coming out to New York in person to do this. So I found that interesting and disturbing, and as John said, not surprising. But what I felt was interesting about it, and again, I don't know if there's going to be coverage, I don't know if there's going to be media on it. Remember something. The decision to have the Nakba commemorated on Israel's independence is a problem.
Yes.
Because what they're basically saying is that it's not their national aspiration, it's our existence that's the problem. So if you need an answer for why there's not going to be peace, it's that celebration and commemoration. So guess who's going to be celebrating it? The IRA is going to be celebrating it. Terrorists and people who are allied with terrorist groups around the country and around the world, not so much again in our country, but in those kind of places are going to be commemorating the Nakba. So that's May 15th.
Which means to me, that BDS is still alive, and all this is still alive. That those 15 years, right? That the Balfour and Rothschild, all that, it would have died on the vine. And it would never have happened. It wasn't for
Maybe.
that's mine.
I wonder, by the way, that with this discussion, and it was a good discussion, by the way, I don't mind having a half hour to talk about Israel, especially as we're coming up on the May 15th date, which, by the way, next year, Israel independence, and on the secular calendar, as we mentioned, I think before, May 14th and May 15th next year will be Israel Independence Day on the Jewish calendar and on the secular calendar. They'll be right up on each other next year because it's the 76th anniversary. And as I mentioned, every 19 years, the Hebrew calendar lines up with the issue of the leap year and that extra day. So I just want, by the way, I wonder, I shouldn't say anything right now, but I just want to make sure that we're actually still on. Because this whole discussion could have kicked us off too, by the way. Now we're on. So what? What?
So then did God? You know, we're reading
Yeah.
sometimes about God and, you know, everybody take care of all these people and everyone says, no, don't do it. Now all of a sudden, in order for Israel to be reestablished 2,000 years later, the slaughter occurred.
Well, that's
a deep.
well, as we said, that fits that's a theological discussion that we've talked about. We've talked about it on Tuesdays, and we've talked about it before in other days, on Wednesdays and Shabbat and other. It's a tough one because this is where people say this level of miracle and this level of tragedy, the anti-miracle, whatever you want to call it, doesn't seem to be rationally explained. But as I said yesterday, as we're reading Isaiah, we have to live in this moment and celebrate this moment. The fact that we are lucky enough to be in this moment where Israel is where it is. And look, you know, you asked the question to start with, the theoretical question, what if? The other theoretical question that I mentioned yesterday which is a tough one, and we do have to think about it, and we do have to prepare for it, and Israel does it all the time, because they run scenarios all the time. How long? Because you can look back and we can all talk about it. And by the way, maybe the question informs the future, right? The question of what would have happened in 1940 can actually inform what happens in 2040. Because we got to look back too. We got to think about, geopolitics, human behavior, all those kinds of things. We got to think about that. But in the, like, if you ask me what's the real important question, it's that one. Because we can't do anything about the past. We can definitely do something about the future. Yeah, Mary's looking at the door. Why does it keep sound like it's about to open? That's it. Who's trying to come in right now? Anyways, so yeah, let's take a look at Numbers. Yeah, Francine just joined us. Francine, we had an important discussion about Israel, but you did not miss the Torah, because we're going to get into the Torah, and we're going to do something today that we don't do very often. I hold it only for times when it's necessary, or at least I think it helps. I don't know if it's necessary, but I do think it helps. And I'll show you today what I'm talking about. We are, last week we read about Korah. We read about this rebellion against Moses, and the fact that in chapter 16, the Korah, who's a Levite, rises up against Moses and Aaron and says, why are these guys in charge? And then we also read about Datan and Abiram, who are leaders of the tribe of the Reubenites. And there's a earth opening up, and there's also a fire that goes out and destroys everybody. Seems like a 1-2 punch. What's interesting is that where we left off last time is that the fire, when it comes out, it destroys the people, but it doesn't destroy the fire pans that they were using to try to use the incense and to try to see who does God favor. Because remember, Moses had said last week, chapter 16, we're going to have a showdown. You're going to come out with your fire pans. We're going to come out with our fire pans. The Kohanim will come out with Moses and Aaron. The Levites with Korah will come out. We'll see who God likes. And of course, the fire pans that are held by Korah and his band, they all get blown up. They all get on fire, which reminds us of that story we read in Leviticus about Nadav and Avihu, who also get burned up with their fire pans. Now, what happens here in these fire pans, they get hammered together, and this is what we left off with. They're hammered together for plating for the altar, because they were used for God. Can't just toss them away, right? And it says, let them serve as a warning for the people of Israel. And it says that Eleazar, who is again the priest, the son of Aaron, he takes them and he hammers them into that. And what we left off with was this last line, that it is a reminder to the Israelites that no outsider, one not of Aaron's offspring, should presume to offer incense before Adonai and suffer the fate of Korah and his band. Now, we kind of like, that's a good place to leave off, but that's not the end of the story. And I'm going to show you why, because in chapter 17, this idea continues, because it's not the end. And I will actually show you why it's actually not only not the end, it's actually part of a story that there are two stories. There are two stories, and two versions of this story. And that's what I'm going to show you today. So it says, the next day, the whole Israelite people railed against Moses. So you think, like, after that showdown and after these guys get blown up, they got the message, right? We just heard this is a warning, like, for the future. Well, the next day, it's not the warning anymore. The warning doesn't work. And this is pretty crazy, because the Israelites come against Moses and say, you too have brought death upon Adonai's people. But as the community gathered against them, Moses and Aaron turned toward the tent of meeting. The cloud had covered it, and the presence of Adonai had appeared. And when Moses and Aaron reached the tent of meeting, Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, remove yourselves from this community, that I may annihilate them in an instant. And they fell on their faces. So once again, God says, I'm going to destroy everybody. Everyone's gone. And then Moses said to Aaron, take the fire pan, put on it fire from the altar, add incense, and take it quickly to the community and make expiation for them. For wrath has gone forth from Adonai, the plague has begun. Now, what is interesting here is that God says to them, I'm going to kill everybody. And Moses says to Aaron, Moses knows what's going to happen. And Moses says, go out there with the fire pan and incense, Aaron, and try to save the people because they're about to die in a plague. That's not what God said initially. He says, I'm going to annihilate, but Moses knows what it means. And Moses's response now, like he did before with God, after, last week we read, God said, don't destroy the people. I mean, God, Moses said to God, don't destroy the people. Please, God, don't do it. It'll look bad, right? That's his argument. It'll look bad. But here, he doesn't even argue with God. He just says, go out there, Aaron, and stop this from happening. Try to stop this plague. Try to make expiation. Try to make amends for them. Try to make up for this, right? Try to create some type of, right here, kaper, like in Kippurim, like Yom Kippur. Try to make some atonement for them. Right? So Aaron took it. And again, this is the part of the story that people forget. They always talk about the earth opening up and the fire coming out, but they forget this next day, it's still going on. And this is the next part, which is the plague. He stood between the dead and the living until the plague was checked. Those who died of the plague came to 14,700, aside from those who died on account of Korach. So we read about the Korach band, the 250 people that had died, from the other incident yesterday, and then another 14,700 die here. Wow. Aaron then returned to Moses at the tent of meeting since the plague was checked. So Aaron comes back to him after the plague's over. So they know when the plague is over. Like they know the Magifah. They know that this plague is done. However they know it, they see it, they feel it, they sense it. Whatever indication is that this is going on. Once they know it, they come back, they reunite back at the tent of meeting. And Adonai spoke to Moses saying, speak to the Israelite people and take from them, from the chieftains of their ancestral houses, one staff for each chieftain of an ancestral house, 12 staffs in all, inscribe each one's name on his staff. There being one staff for each head of the ancestral house, also inscribe Aaron's name on the staff of Levi. Deposit them in the tent of meeting before the pact, right? Before the ark, where I meet with you. The staff of the candidate whom I choose shall sprout, and I will rid myself of the incessant mutterings of the Israelites against you. So there's one more miracle that God, like you would have thought that the earthquake, the earth opening up, the fire, the plague, that would have sent the message. But there's one more. And what's interesting about this supernatural event is that it seems like the least amazing. It seems like the least impressive. But look at this one. It's going to sprout. Okay, they're going to take a stick, and the stick for the tribe that I am choosing will sprout. Moses spoke to the Israelites. The chieftains gave him a staff for each chieftain of an ancestral house, 12 staff in all. Among those was that of Aaron. Moses deposited the staffs before Adonai in the tent of the pact. The next day, Moses entered the tent of the pact, and there was the staff of Aaron, the house of Levi, had sprouted, and it brought forth sprouts, produced blossoms, and bore almonds. So it didn't just sprout, it had flowers, and it had fruit. So this is clearly a miracle. And this is a miracle that they all see. There's not a question why. And by the way, it's not a punishment. It's a soft miracle. It's a soft act of God. And it says Moses brought all the staffs out from before Adonai to all the Israelites. So he took them out of the tent, brought them all, and each identified and recovered his staff. And Adonai said to Moses, put Aaron's staff before the pact to be kept as a lesson to the rebels, so that their mutterings against me may cease, lest they die. And Moses did just as Adonai commanded him, so he did. Let's pause right there. So what's interesting about the staff is that they keep it. And that's going to be a reminder to the people. Look who God chose. God chose Aaron and the Kohanim. And as I mentioned last week, that seems to be the point of this whole text. The point of this text, folks, is that Aaron and his family are in charge. Even the Levites don't have this kind of power. So this is kind of the point of what we just read the last couple of weeks. Okay. Well, before we read the next part, I just want to show, this is where I'm going to show you something. Right. So I'm going to do this. And as I said, I don't do this a lot. I don't dwell a lot on this, but I'm going to do it now for this reason, which is I'm going to show you the different authors. And the reason I do this every so often is so that you can actually have a little help in understanding what just happened. Because what we have is two stories here. And the stories have been woven together. And I'm going to show you in this colored version. It's not so easy to see the color, but you can see the bold versus the not bold. So let me explain what we're looking at here. We're not going to read it again because we read it. This is chapter 16 and you'll see chapter 17. I have 2 pages here. This is from this book right here, the Bible with sources revealed by a New View into the 5 Books of Moses by Richard Elliott Friedman, author of Who Wrote the Bible. So he does have this at the end of his book, Who Wrote the Bible. He has the chapters and verses that he thought each author wrote. But in this Bible, he has his translation and then he highlights it. So it's much easier to read along with it rather than just have chapters and verses and have to go back and forth and see. And well, here's why. Because when I was in his class 35 years ago, I had my Bible and I highlighted it all. I highlighted it. I had 4 different colors and I highlighted it. I remember, actually I might still have that Bible. It had pink, blue, yellow and green. And I went through and I highlighted the Bible according to, again, where he had identified the sources. Well, that's what this is. This is the thing that I did a long time ago, which I'd asked him to do. I'm sure other people asked him to do it too. I wasn't the first or the last to do this. And so this is the version of it. So what helps in this is, again, looking at these stories. And so, as I said, sometimes the 2 versions of the stories are obviously they're very similar, but when you look at the 2 stories separately, they make a lot more sense. And so I only point this out when it actually helps us understand the text. If it doesn't help us, I don't deal with it because for the most part, it's seamless and it's just nice the way the text is woven together. But sometimes there's questions or contradictions in it. You wonder, like, what's going on here? As I said, I very rarely do it. And most of the times I do it when we're reading Genesis. Like I'll do it when I show you the 2 different versions of the creation story, or when we look at the 2 different versions of the flood story, or the weird kinds of differences between the way that Joseph's sold into slavery. There's 2 different versions of the same story, and the editors wove these stories together. Well, here we have 2 different versions of this rebellion, and the 2 stories actually teach different lessons. And what's interesting is that they're woven together pretty well. And again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want you to see this, that the stories teach a different lesson, and they actually are easier understood separately. So here's what I'm going to show you. I'll show you that the part that is the not bold, it's actually in green, is what we call the J author. And what's interesting is he actually doesn't put footnotes a lot. He only puts them down where they're actually where they're actually important. The bold in blue is the P author, what we call the priestly author. Well, guess what? The priestly author is really concerned with Korach and the Levites and making sure that that the Levites are not in charge. The J author is really not concerned with that. Now, we do know that the J author and the E, what we call the E author, they're really easy to see because the E author refers to Adonai as Elohim. And so when we have those authors, it's really easy to see who writes which. But the priestly author, oftentimes uses Adonai, uses the Yud Hey Vav Hey name, and the J author always uses Adonai. So it's not easy to see based on what God is called. But when you see these two stories, there is a really interesting thing that the J author is concerned about, because the J author is not really concerned with the Levites. He's concerned with, and by the way, if you ask the J author, a Levite can offer a sacrifice. It's the P author who wants you to know, no Levite can offer a sacrifice. We don't even want them to put anything on an incense pan. Look at the J author first. That's the shorter one. It says, Datan, Abiram, and On, the sons of Reuben, got up in front of Moses and again, or it just says, you don't have to have and Moses sent and called them. He said, when you look at the story here, what really happens is Datan are rising up against Moses. And if you look at got up in front, would better be translated as went against Moses. And then it says, as Moses called them and they wouldn't come. Now we already know that in this story, Korach confronts Moses and doesn't have any issue going right in front of him. Datan and Abiram are not. They're not coming near. They won't even come near him. And what's interesting is in their story, it's not an issue of the priests. It's an issue of who's politically in charge of the tribes. Who's in charge? And Datan and Abiram and the elders are basically saying we're in charge, right? And it has really nothing to do with who offers sacrifices. It has to do with leadership. And their issue really is that they want to go in. They want to go to the land of Israel, or they just don't want Moses to call the shots anymore. And in this story, Datan and Abiram and his band all get swallowed up and they go into the earth. In the story that is the priestly story, what happens in that story is that Korach and his band, they all get burned up. Because if you read the story without the earth swallowing up, they got up from around the tabernacle of Korach, and all the people were with Korach on all the property. The fire had gone out, and it consumed the 250 people offering the incense. And Adonai says, pick up that stuff. And then the rest of the story is all the story of the plague and of what happens, which is really, again, this message of don't mess with the priests. Now, why am I showing you this? Why do I say these two stories are somewhat, they're somewhat different? They're both stories of rebellion that got woven together.
Charlie,
Why am I showing you this? Because there's a problem here. If the earth just swallowed up a bunch of people, like what more needs to be said? The earth opened up and swallowed everybody, and wouldn't it have swallowed up everybody who had a problem? In this story, what really happens is you see that it's the priests that have an issue with the Levites, and that the problem is solved after this. At the end of this story, it's not about Korach and his band getting swallowed up. It's about Korach and his band and the rest of the Levites getting burned up because they're not supposed to offer up sacrifices. So what happens with the way we have it is that the earth swallowing up some people, bad people, the band of rebels, is that the climactic event is then followed by another climactic event. Each author had a climactic event. They were both pretty disturbing. They were both pretty eventful. And the way the story kind of weaves them together is you're like, well, why is God still going around killing people? Isn't it fixed? Didn't the people get the message? And again, in this case, it's with Korah and those priests or those Levites trying to be priests versus the Kohanim. And when it's just that, it makes a lot more sense. And it really, as I said last week, it's the real point of this story. The earth swallowing up a band of rebels was woven into this, and to some extent takes away from what really is happening here, which is that anybody who thinks that a Levite can offer up a sacrifice or an incense offering, look, remember this. Remember what happened, and remember the sprouting staff. Because, man, if the earth swallowed up, what more do you need? Like, you're going to argue with God anymore? No, obviously they do, and they still do. And you could argue that nothing's going to stop them. But this is the climactic event right here. The earth swallows them all up. So,
It's God's. Quite the authoritarian.
yes, but God almost looks like a psychopath if the stories aren't separated. Yeah, but it's like God hits them there and then hits them there. And it's like, well, doesn't God know how to, even if you make the argument God has to do it, God's forced into punishing them, but then why don't you punish them, God, so that they get the message without you then having to come back after you swallowed them all up to hit them with a plague?
Yeah. they ain't doing it.
Yes. But the story doesn't really, well, I'm not going to say it doesn't work, because there are people who don't know this and don't care about this. But to me, it's not a good story. It's not it's not a sense of, well, it's really not, if you think about it, because the earth swallowed, that's all that people remember. What I want to tell you is that most people don't remember the rest of they don't remember chapter 17. They don't remember that there was a plague after that, because all they think about is the earth swallowing up the people. And they think the earth swallowed up Korah. And if you look at what the author is actually, the priestly author actually said, Korah and the rest of the bad Levites, they got burned up just like Nadav and Avihu did, which to me is consistent, makes more sense. It's a more logical story. And you're saying, well, is anything where God is burning people up logical? Yeah, it's logical. It's consistent. It's logical in its consistency. And it also makes God not look like just willy-nilly, just hitting people with different stuff. And I think that each one had an issue. Moses as a political leader telling people they can't go into the land. And then the other issue, which is really a big issue. Only the priests, only the Kohanim can offer sacrifices. Levites can't. And this is not the end of the discussion, because as we know, it's still going on in the book of Judges. It's still going on in the book of Samuel. It's still going on even in the book of Kings. And as long as there are priests that are Kohanim, as long as there are they're the power, right? They don't want Levites offering up sacrifices anywhere, anytime, at all. There's no room for that. So that's what's so important about this text. And that's why that's why I show it to you. And again, I don't do it very often. I only do it when you look at the two stories, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's a story of Datan and Abiram, and then there's a story of Korah. So they were woven together to kind of say that this big rebellion was, well, how else are you going to tell it? But by the way, why would the J author? There's one other little tiny thing I'm just going to throw out at you, which I think you'll get. Those of us who've been reading the Bible, you've been reading it for a year and a half. You've been reading it for more years. You'll know this too. Why is it so important that Datan and Abiram are from the tribe of Reuben? Anybody? Datan and Abiram, as we saw last week, I'll just show you, are from the tribe of Reuben, right? Reuben is the oldest tribe. They're tribe number one. What do we know about the J author? He's from the tribe of Judah. And what he did just now, he just stuck it to the Reubenites. He just stuck it to the oldest tribe. If you want another reminder of why Judah's in charge and why are tribes like Reuben not in charge, because they're bad. They do bad things. They rebelled against Moses. So the J author just dug into Reuben. Needless to say,
He's making the story of, them all coming down to Egypt, Reuben is discredited.
correct. And every time Reuben gets discredited, you can guess that that's a J story. It's not hard to figure it out. By the way, when you want to see where Reuben is a hero, look at look why we have one version of the Joseph story where Reuben tries to save Joseph, and the other version where Judah tries to save Joseph. Each group of Israelites wanted to claim that their ancestor tried to save Joseph. So there's actually a logic to it. There's a reason why these stories existed the way they did, why they told the stories the way they did. And that's why, by the way, that the only hero, the only other good person besides Joshua is Caleb from the tribe of Judah. So Judah is doing the right thing even back in the desert. They're the only tribe to some extent that gets it right, with the exception of the Kohanim. They're the only people getting it right. Guess why? We believe that the Bible, at least the Torah, most of it, was written by two main authors. The J author, who's from Judah, and the P author, who's a Kohen. So if you're going to write about your ancestors, generally speaking, they're going to be the heroes. It makes sense. So it's not surprising. It all makes sense. And quite frankly, it's consistent and it makes sense when you think about it. So I want to tell people, when you look at things in the Torah that you're like, that doesn't make sense. Well, it might not make sense, but there also might be a reason for it, which is that there's two different versions of that story. So, that story doesn't end there. Well, it does in a way, but there is another part of this that's important, because according to the way the tale is given to us, and at least the way we have it in the final version, the staffs do indeed, kind of set the tone for the future, which is look at the staffs and you'll know. But the Israelites said to Moses, "Lo, we perish. We are lost. All of us lost. Everyone who so much as ventures near Adonai's tabernacle must die. Alas, we are doomed to perish." Now, that's the way the chapter ends. It's not a really great chapter break, because it's not the end of the story. It's kind of like the middle of the next idea, which is that after all this punishment, the people are scared to death. So even if they only read even if the version of this was only the version of the fire and the plague, the people were like, whoa, God's really mad. And we better never get near the tabernacle again. Let's just stay as far away from that area as possible. Now, that's not going to be good, because now the people are afraid of God. And that's what it just said. The people were afraid of God. And it makes sense. Adonai said to Aaron, "You and your sons in the ancestral house under your charge shall bear any guilt connected with the sanctuary. You and your sons alone shall bear any guilt connected with the priesthood." And so what's interesting here, of course, is that Aaron and the Kohanim, his descendants, are given this tremendous responsibility, but he also has this tremendous responsibility, which is, you screw up, you're the ones who are punished from now on. So yeah, it's power and responsibility. And for us, it's really a lot of responsibility. I don't know how much power there is. There's fame, maybe there's sense of pride, maybe, but it's a lot of responsibility, And they're taking it on, because if this was written by the priestly author is telling his descendants and essentially writing it back to his ancestor. Aaron was told, you can't screw up. And if you do, it's no one's fault but your own. And that's what they wrote. That's what they said. That's what they taught. You shall also associate with yourself, your kinsmen, the tribe of Levi, your ancestral tribe, to be attached to you and to minister to you while you and your sons under your charge are before the tent of the pact. They shall discharge their duties to you and to the tent as a whole, but they must not have any contact with the furnishings of the shrine or the altar, lest both they and you die. So the Levites, again, even though we had this horrible experience with Korah, They're not thrown out. The Levites are still good, but they can't do the heavy lifting. They can't do the real stuff. They can be around there. They're helping you. They're doing their stuff. They're still important. They're still doing their duties. They're still carrying the stuff. But they're not allowed to touch the ark. They cannot touch the shrine. They can't touch those kinds of things. Only you and your family can do that. The Levites can't touch it. They can come close. They can't touch it. They shall be attached to you and discharge the duties of the tent of meeting, all the service of the tent, but no outsider shall intrude upon you. As you discharge,
Rabbi, does this mean only Levites are allowed to touch the scrolls?
no, that doesn't say anything about scrolls. This is simply the stuff that's in the tabernacle. This is not the tabernacle itself, right? Because they're carrying that. They're carrying the tent, they're carrying the poles, they're carrying the frame, they're carrying all that stuff. But they're not allowed to carry the stuff that's inside the inner shrine. They can't carry the tabernacle. They can't carry the altar. They can't carry the these kinds of like the menorah. They can't carry those things. They can't touch them. Only the priest can touch them. They can carry the walls, if you will, but they can't carry the goods. They can't carry those things.
This is not something we do today.
Not today, though the Levites still, there's a tradition of the Levites washing the hands and feet of the Kohanim during the high holidays. Not at our synagogue, not at conservative synagogues, but at some Orthodox synagogues, there is a ritual of having the priests wash before the Birkat Kohanim at the high holidays. So if there's one vestige of this today, it's that. And other than that, and again, other than that subgroup, that's the only time that we see it. And of course, we also now know, well, first of all, we know the family histories of who are Levites and who are Kohanim. We still keep that alive. People still know if they're a Kohen or if they're a Levi. They have that. They have that knowledge. And now we also have the DNA. We have the DNA. We don't have the DNA yet really for Levites. We have the DNA for Kohanim. And we all have Kohanic DNA. Or no, yeah, I mean, we all have a trace of it because we have ancestors that were at one point, well, not all of us, but you take a sample of the Jewish community and there will be people who don't know they're Kohanim, that'll have Kohanic DNA. Not everyone has Kohanic DNA, but if you take a Jewish community, if you take the Jewish community of America and do a test, there will be people that'll come back with that, a high propensity of that DNA. And actually that search for that DNA is what will determine whether a community is thought to be Jewish or not. So in the Ethiopian Jewish community, they did the DNA test on them and it didn't come back with the Kohanic DNA. Basically said that at least biologically, genetically, they weren't connected to the Jewish community. On the contrary, when we did a DNA test on the Lemba of South Africa, who were also African, turned out they did have the Kohanic DNA. And they're even further south than the Ethiopians, which leads us to believe that their tradition of saying they're descendants of Jews was true. They were profiled on 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes did a story about them about 20 years ago. They've replayed it a couple of times. It's an interesting story. And we've done it with other groups that claim that they're have Jewish identity. If we do that test and it shows that there are people in that group that have the Kohanic DNA, then we'll say that as a group that they're higher likelihood that they're Jewish. But anyways, we don't have Levite DNA though. We don't say, well, that's Levite DNA yet. We might one day, but right now we haven't isolated this, though according to the Torah, he was a Levite. Aaron and Moses were Levites. And by the way, it goes back to 3,000 years ago, so almost 3,500 years. So it goes back to this period, that DNA marker. So again, the Levites, I hereby take your fellow Levites from among the Israelites. They are assigned to you in dedication to Adonai to do the work of the tent of meeting. while you and your sons shall be careful to perform your priestly duties in everything pertaining to the altar and to what is behind the curtain. I make your priesthood a service of dedication. Any outsider who encroaches shall be put to death. So if you thought I was making an issue of the priesthood and the Levites, like by showing you the authorship, you understand why I did that? Because they're still talking about it. The Torah is still telling you. And to some extent, there's more. Look, there were 3 verses about the earth swallowing up the people, which is what we all remember. We've already read 10 more verses about the priests, having special responsibilities that the Levites help them, but they can't do. So which seems to be more important, at least based on the level of detail and the level of emphasis on here. It's this. The story is to teach us this, right? Adonai spoke further to Aaron. I hereby give you charge of all of my gifts, all the sacred donations of the Israelites. I grant them to you and to your sons as a prerequisite, a due for all time. And again, the translation of this would be, this is yours. I'm giving this to you as a translation literally is a gift, but it's these are what the people are giving, and they're yours. This shall be yours from the most holy sacrifices, the offerings by fire, every such offering that they render to me as most holy sacrifices, namely every meal offering, sin offering, and guilt offering of theirs shall belong to you and your sons. You shall partake of them as most sacred donations. Only males may eat of them. You shall treat them as consecrated. Let's see if this note says, no, consecrated for your use. It's the same thing. This too shall be yours. The gift offerings of their contributions, all the elevations of the Israelites, I give to you. And it says parenthetically, but it's really it's pretty clear that it's to you and your wives, to your sons and to the daughters that are with you. As a due for, I was just looking at the translation, as a due for all time, every one of your household who is pure may eat of it. So again, some offerings are only for the men to eat, right? These sacrifices, sin and guilt offerings, they are for the men. But these offerings, the elevation offerings, are for the family and for women too. Women can eat of them. Now, you're wondering to yourself, well, this isn't the book of Leviticus. Why are we still talking about this kind of stuff? Well, clearly, people who may not have had the book of Leviticus in front of them or didn't understand that, again, this is a trade-off, if you will, or this is the recompense, or this is the benefit of being a priest, is that you get this food for you, and in some cases for your family. All the best of the new oil, wine, and grain, the choice parts that they present to Adonai, I give it to you. Right? The first fruits in their land that they bring to Adonai shall be yours. Every one of your household who's pure may eat of them. Now, what's interesting about this, of course, is that you and I would normally think, well, what's going to God? If the priests are getting all this stuff, what is God getting? Well, God clearly is getting this, these pieces of it, but the majority of it is going to the priests, which is why they were very, very wealthy.
It was full.
Yeah. Yeah. And as the population increases, as the amount of priests increase, this system gets really, really corrupt. Again, it makes sense when they're a tribe, when they're a few thousand people. But if there's a few million people, this is not a sustainable system. And this is what we had by the Roman period. Like this didn't make sense anymore. It's too much. Too much wealth. To some extent, remember, the purpose of this was to keep the priests fed and to help support them sustain them because they didn't own their own land. Well, by the time of the Roman era, they owned all of Jerusalem. They owned everything around Jerusalem because they had nothing to do with this stuff other than to turn around and sell it. Couldn't eat it all. You couldn't eat it all. You had money coming in from around the world. There were Jews living in Spain already by that point. There were Jews living in probably in India by that point. They were sending in money into Jerusalem or sacrifices or offerings or whatever else they wanted to support the temple. And not just Jews, but Gentiles too. And so what did they do with their money? They just bought stuff. Remember, not only food, everything that has been proscribed in Israel shall be yours. So again, what is proscribed? Well, it says look back in Leviticus, but anything that was harem, anything that was decided to be essentially taken away from people, right? If something was declared to be impure or unusable from the people, punished by taking it away from them, went to the priest too. Which, by the way, who decides that? Well, the priests do. If they said this was harem, if this was now, again, the word proscribed essentially is a fancy way of saying, it's not yours anymore. For whatever reason, because it's got, it's been tainted, it's been declared to be impure. That's now going to the priests. The first male issue of the womb of every being, human or beast, that is offered to Adonai shall be yours. But you shall have the male firstborn of human beings redeemed. And you shall also have the firstling of impure animals redeemed. And that's the tradition of Pidyon Haben, redemption of the firstborn sons. You don't give your kids to them. You give them, they get a value, they get a ransom for it. They get a value of those. And the priests would get those from human beings. But for the animals, they got the animals. So the first calf that your cow ever had, not every calf, not every year when they gestated, but the first calf that came out of your cow was given to the priests. That's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of stuff. They were carnivores. And even if you weren't eating it, you could sell it to somebody. They could have sold it to somebody else.
Salt then? Yeah, salt.
They use salt, yeah.
Yeah. Salt in the
So what did they do with this stuff? They became wealthy, really wealthy. Take as their redemption price from age 1 month and up, the money equivalent of 5 shekels of the sanctuary weight, which is 20 gerahs. So that is the redemption price, right? That's the Pidyon Haben. That is the human firstborn, right? But the firstlings of cattle, sheep, or goats may not be redeemed. They are consecrated. You shall dash their blood against the altar and turn their fat into smoke as an offering by fire for a pleasing odor of Adonai to God, right? Right. So you offer up the fat, you offer up the parts that you weren't going to eat anyways. And then the rest of the meat is yours. It shall be yours like the breast of elevation offerings and like the right thigh. So the priests got that. The priests got that. Their families got that. Because this wasn't the sin offering. This wasn't the guilt offering. This was like the elevation offering. And we heard before that those went to the families. All the sacred gifts that the Israelites set aside from Adonai, I give to you, to your sons and to the daughters that are with you for all due time. And look at this, John, right here. It shall be an everlasting covenant of salt. Look at this, before Adonai, for you and for your offspring as well. And that is interesting too, because they had a covenant, and to some extent, that's what it's called, a brit melach, the covenant of salt. And so salt was very important for the priests. They used it as part of the offerings. And it was considered something that was sacred. It was very, very expensive too. And so people used to use it as barter. They used to use it as something of value that they would trade.
that meat from going bad.
Yeah, but people would trade salt, they would take salt from one place to another. There were people who, that was their job, taking caravans of salt from one place to another so that people could have salt where they lived. They have salt mines in Europe, yeah,
Didn't you do that?
in Krakow. They had salt mines in Ukraine. They were fighting over them in Solomon not too long ago. Anyways, what's interesting about this, of course, is that this is why, at least for us, we have kosher salt. The reason we have kosher salt is not because there's anything inherently kosher with the salt, but because it's not from an animal, but it is something that was offered up on the altar. And if it was dedicated to another god before it was to our God, you couldn't then use it for our God. So you had to make sure that the salt was never offered up to another god. So kosher seal on it would tell you it wasn't, just like wine, which is why we have kosher wine. There's nothing inherently not kosher about wine. Every wine is kosher by its, well, I shouldn't say that. Sometimes they use, they can use in the filtration process. Sometimes they use stuff that is made out of animals. But generally speaking, there's nothing in the wine that is based on meat or anything that would mix milk and meat. But because it could be offered to another god, you had to make sure that it was not. And so putting a kosher seal on it and making sure that it wasn't was one of the ways to keep it kosher, to keep it fit. So there we go. Adonai said to Aaron, you shall, however, have no territorial share among them or any portion in their midst. I am your portion, your share among the Israelites. Right? So that's the trade-off. You don't get any land that's your tribal share. So that's the trade-off. Now, territorial share, clearly later on, when they owned all this territory. But it's different than owning a piece of land and having a tribal share. So, I don't know. All we know is that later on, we're going to read Jeremiah, our next prophet that we're going to be reading about. It's a very famous scene where he buys some, redeems some property that's in his family. He takes ownership of it. Well, he's a priest. What did he owned property? By Jeremiah's time, priests were already owning property. So they may not have had ancestral territories, but as the tribes, as we stop knowing what tribal areas were tribal areas anymore. Remember, by the time of Jesus, there was really no tribal area anymore. That's why talking about Jesus being born in Bethlehem of Judah, yeah, it's nice to say that he was from the same area of King David, but nobody talked about tribes by then. They weren't talking about the tribe of Zebulun or Issachar. No one knew where the tribal lands were anymore. There was Israel. There was Judea. They didn't talk about the tribes anymore. So maybe they could own land, and they did own land, but they're not supposed to have a territorial share that we identify as this is the Levite territory. This is the territory of the Kohanim. They could own a building, they could own a piece of land, they could own property, but they didn't own a territory. There was no state of the Levites, so to speak. Okay. Just so you know, I mean, this isn't our issue, it's not my issue, but I will tell you it's one of the reasons why also priests were not supposed to own land in the church. They were kind of following this tradition, which is that they got money, they got stuff, but they weren't supposed to have territories that were theirs. Of course, that's not the way it was for a lot of the Middle Ages and what we call the papal states later on during the time of early days of Italy. I mean, Italy literally had to fight against the Pope in order to take control of what later became Italy, because there was, and there still is, Vatican territory, which is their territory. It's their country. But but there was that real debate over whether, and again, whether they were supposed to, whether the priests felt that they were supposed to have that kind of territory. And yeah, it's one of the reasons why priests don't own their own homes. They're not supposed to. I want to say that the vow of poverty would kind of imply that you don't own your own home. But yeah, it's still relevant to some people. Yeah. Generally speaking, most people don't want their religious leaders to be super wealthy. It doesn't look good. What's the issue? Because
When the church owns it. when the synagogue
yeah,
owns it.
but whether the synagogue owns it or whether the synagogue owns it, that's a different thing. But if the individual owns it, I would say that flashy wealth for people is not, and even to some extent in the Orthodox world, doesn't matter whether you're a rabbi, flashy wealth is not considered to be a good look. And to some extent, it's because of what your priorities are. There also is this kind of understanding of like, are people abusing their resources, and are they getting wealthy off of their service to God, right? So, look, I can make the argument, I can have a salary and then I can take it and invest it in stock, and I do well on the stock, but nobody's going to go, oh, he's really good at investing money. They're just going to say, why are we paying him so much? So I've never had that problem. And I don't want to have, look, one of the reasons I didn't want. So that's an interesting question. So John just said, what if you were born into it? So there are people who do that. Generally speaking, again, it's not, I think it's considered to be not something you want to brag about, because I think there's a sense that it's not really a humble, there's no humble brag on that. So there's really no end where that comes out as a good thing. That being said, I think there are people who still say, well, that guy can do that because his family's really wealthy. There's also a sense of interestingly, you say that, John, is that if somebody comes from a wealthy family, and let's say they go into the rabbinate, man or woman, I think there's also this assumption somehow that person's family should help support the synagogue too, by the way, which I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm not saying that's like the way it should be, but I think there is that assumption sometimes if they say, hey, that rabbi's family is really wealthy. Now, look, this wasn't an issue anyways until probably the late 80s, early 90s, because for the most part, that just didn't happen a lot. It does happen a little bit more now. It's sometimes funny when you hear about somebody, and there always have been examples, by the way, even going back to the 50s of somebody, I know one rabbi in particular that they always said, well, his family is really wealthy, and so we don't need to pay him very much. And that didn't fly well, but I can think of one in particular. It wasn't in LA, but yeah, I mean, it's an interesting issue. The midrash, and it's, we see it in the Talmud. There are discussions over whether prophets or whether religious leaders are supposed to be wealthy. And there's this wonderful midrash that when Moses creates the second set of 10 commandments, right? When the first set are broken by him, and then he carves the next set because God makes him carve the next set. There's a midrash that Moses saved the shards of what he carved, because when he carved the second set of 10 commandments, he carved them into sapphire. Now, that's obviously a lot of chips of sapphire left. So he had all these shards, and according to the midrash, he owned those. He kept them. They were his, and he was wealthy from it. And there's also these traditions that some of the other prophets that we read about, including Isaiah, were wealthy. So there's this understanding that it wasn't impossible for them to be wealthy. But there's also this understanding that at the same time, some of them were really not wealthy, and that while it's not an obstacle to your prophetic abilities, definitely the prophets can't focus on that. And was there a legitimacy to like an Elijah who doesn't seem to have anything, right? Who doesn't seem to have any property and seems to be like one of the most powerful prophets? I don't know. There's definitely that sense. And in the Orthodox world today, ostentatious presentations of wealth are not looked on very kindly. The only times where you see presentations of wealth within the Orthodox world, especially the ultra-Orthodox world, is when it comes to celebrations of weddings and those kinds of things, where sometimes there'll just be these giant parties that are put on, and you're like, that party must have cost $500,000. It's about the only time I ever see it. But driving fancy cars, there are rabbis and cantors and that I know, especially here in LA, that drive some pretty fancy cars, but it's not considered to be a good look. I don't think most people want to see it. And again, look, it's a challenge, it's a challenge in this world today, when it comes to how people present themselves. And so, yeah, I thought about it before. It's definitely been something that I've been conscious about. So, it goes back to the Torah. It definitely goes back to the priests. And there is a trade-off. There's a trade-off. Yeah. I had just say one more, because I just had the discussion with my wife yesterday. Look, it's an interesting thing to speculate. As I've gotten to the age now where you can start looking back and making these calculations, you say, well, like, what if you went into what if you were a lawyer? What if you did something else? And what kind of wealth would you have had by this point? It's a difficult question to ask. It's one of those theoretical questions you don't have an answer to, right? But I will tell you that, I just had this discussion yesterday with my wife. What? Yeah, but it's an interesting one because it's one of those theoretical questions or one of those what if questions that you ask yourself. And you just wonder what the trajectory, how the trajectory would have been different. And yeah, I have an interesting take on it, which I might share in the future. But I definitely am thinking about it more now as I get to the point where you start to think about what have you accumulated when it comes to your life. What are the financial accumulations? What are the senses of success and what are the legacies you create. So anyways, that is a discussion that we see in the Torah, and the rabbis have it. And look, some of the most famous rabbis in the Talmud were wealthy. Rabbi Hillel was wealthy. His family were wealthy. His family was wealthy for generations. His descendants, Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Judah Hanasi, they are so wealthy that the Talmud describes their mansions and their ranches. Yeah, their whole family were rabbis. Their whole families were traditional, like leaders of the community in Israel. Seem to have owned lots of property, lots of fields, lots of agricultural fields. It doesn't seem like it was a direct result only of like because they were a rabbi, but because maybe they had the political power. Maybe because they had those connections that they had that. But there's no question, based on the descriptions in the Talmud, that they were some of the wealthiest people in the world. In their world, in their not in the whole world, but in their sphere. I mean, that they were the leaders of politically and economically of the community. So it wasn't like they were mutually exclusive. And there's the argument that we have in this country that our religious, or not religious leaders, but our community leaders in America, in the last 20 or 30 years, de facto were the wealthiest. So whether or not the leader of America, of American Judaism, in the 30s and 40s, the people who were the visible leaders of the Jewish community, people like Stephen S. Wise, who was was the leader of the Free Synagogue in New York, Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver, who was in Cleveland, Rabbi Silverman and your rabbi in Detroit, Joyce, Rabbi Morris Adler,
Yeah.
one of the leaders they were rabbinic leaders, right? They were leaders of the American Jewish community. Today, we would say that the American Jewish leaders, to some extent, are wealthiest people in the Jewish community. I mean, many people would say that, and he is deceased now, but many people would say Sheldon Adelson was the most powerful Jewish leader in America. He dictated what things would happen in American Jewry to some extent by his money. No, Edgar Bronfman, who was the head of Seagram's, became no, and that's the point, that these people now were dictating what the future of American Judaism would look like. The people who funded and decided, hey, we're going to create birthright. Those were not rabbis who did it. Those were the wealthiest American Jews who decided that that's what it's going to look like. So,
Boulevard Temple, Rabbi Magnin from the clothing company.
yeah, he was from the Magnin family. Well, that's an example. That was one of the examples I was going to say of rabbis who came from wealth. But there is this like today, it's not even an issue, because if the shot calling, if the leadership is being made by those people. So when Roosevelt was trying to get Jews to calm down about not letting America open up to taking in refugees, like we've had this discussion, John, when Roosevelt was trying to calm the Jewish community, he didn't call rich Jews. He called Rabbi Weiss. He called the American Jewish rabbinic leaders and called them together. And at the time, Rabbi Weiss had his own radio program. He called them and said, calm down, tell the Jewish community to calm down. But he didn't call those other people. Today, most of the people that we would say, if an American president wants to influence the Jewish community and vice versa, he'd call somebody like Sheldon Adelson. He'd call those kinds of people. It's not the rabbis anymore who would call those shots. So it's an interesting question, because maybe we're back to the priesthood essentially being not chosen by God, but to some extent chosen by their economic power, and not necessarily by their religious knowledge or by their leadership. I don't know. Look, Britain has a chief rabbi, the guy who went to the coronation. That's Rabbi Mervis. He's a Jewish leader. He's a Jewish leader because he was chosen to be the head rabbi of the. We don't have a chief rabbi in this country, and we're the most powerful Jewish community outside of Israel. Our most powerful leaders are probably not rabbis. And if they are, they're what? We don't need a chief rabbi, and we've functioned for a long time without a chief rabbi. But we're one of the only countries in the world that doesn't have a chief rabbi. Israel has 2 chief rabbis. We have no chief rabbi. So we never have. We talked about doing it about 120 years ago, and it didn't go over. It did not. There was no consensus over who was going to be the chief rabbi. So this was an interesting issue of who gets to influence and who gets to call shots and who's making noise. That's also one of the issues. Who's making noise and who's going to get people to pay attention to them. And by the way, we could also make the argument it's the media too now. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, when we first went to Israel,
Yeah.
we went to, remember, the Gal gave a speech. Tel Aviv was just being built, sand, City Hall.
What? Independence Hall.
Independence Hall.
Yeah.
And the fighting that went on, nobody could agree on anything.
Yeah.
So I'm surprised they even have 2 chief rabbis. If they eat out, right? I laughed. I just died. I was like my family.
Yeah. Well, Israel definitely has a challenge because they have the religious parties that have so much power. But in our country, I'm only saying that as the rabbinate has become less and less powerful, that what's really determined Jewish leadership has been wealth. Look, there was also a period of time when, let's face it, Jewish political leaders were also American political leaders. By that, I mean, if you had a powerful Jewish American political leader, to some extent, people looked at them as a Jewish leader as well. And that's just not the case anymore. I mean, there was a time when, I remember it, so I know that it happened. There was a time when someone like Ed Koch from New York was recognized as a Jewish American leader because he was the mayor of New York and because he spoke kind of on behalf to some extent. He's a recognizable Jewish leader. I remember that. It's not so much the case anymore. And there just isn't a Jewish political leader that we would say, oh, well, that guy, you know how powerful that guy is. And it's just not the case. I think maybe the last person we've seen like that, probably the last person I would say is Lieberman, Joe Lieberman. I think he was the last Jew that was like, he's a leader, he's a political leader, and he's respected, and he's also a Jewish leader, and he knows enough, and he speaks on behalf of Jewish. I think he might be the last one, and I don't know that there'll be another. I mean, I don't say never, but I don't see anybody having that kind of respect or gravitas and being able to speak on behalf of the Jewish community as a political leader. I don't know. Look, there was a window, I'm going to tell you, and I saw it with my own eyes, so I know it. There was a window where my dad was a leader for about 5 years, from about 80 to 85. And it was because he had the media, he had the media leadership. And that was, if he had played his cards differently, if he had created a bigger media imprint, that would have been important. But there's never been a Jewish media tycoon, if you will. And there is in the Christian community. I mean, say what you want, and it's closing, but Pat Robertson was a Christian political leader. Jerry Falwell was a Christian political leader. He wasn't so much just from TV, but he was a media presence. But the Christian media presence of those leaders was power. They had a tremendous amount of power. No, they did not. But interestingly, they were not preaching the gospel of prosperity as much as the the Austeens and those kind of people today. But yeah, no, the Jimmy Swaggart and those kind of people. But the real powerful political leaders were the ones like Billy Graham and to some extent Falwell, who were exercising political power. But again, I don't know what'll happen, but I do know that right now we've kind of come to a time where if you have money in the Jewish community, you're a de facto leader if you want to be. If you're going to throw your money around in the Jewish community, that you can have that leadership, and for better or worse, that's what's happened. That's just what's happened. All right. So let's get back to what the priests do in these times, right? They have no territorial share. I give to the Levites, I give them tithes in Israel as their share in return for the services they perform, the services of the tent of meeting. Henceforth, Israelites shall not trespass the tent of meeting and thus incur guilt and die. So they're not going to die. Only Levites shall perform the services of the tent of meeting. Others would incur guilt. It is a law for all time throughout the ages, but they shall have no territorial share among the Israelites. Again, this is an entire chapter telling us this. For it is the tithe set aside by the Israelites as a gift to Adonai that I give to the Levites as their share. Therefore, I've said concerning them, they have no territorial share among the Israelites. Over and over again, Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the Levites and say to them, when you receive from the Israelites their tithe, which I have assigned to you as your share, you shall set aside from them 1/10 of the tithe as a gift to Adonai. So they're getting a tithe, and then from that tithe, they have to give it. They have to give something to God. They give their own tithe. This shall be accounted to you as a gift, as with the new grain from the threshing floor or the flow from the vat. So again, grain or wine. So shall you set aside for your part, set aside a gift from Adonai from all the tithes that you receive from the Israelites. And from them you shall bring the gift for Adonai to Aaron the priest. You shall set aside all the gifts to Adonai from everything that is donated to you, from each thing that is its best portion, the part thereof is to be consecrated. Say to them further, when you have removed the best part from it, you Levites may consider it as the same as the yield of threshing floor or vat. You and your households may eat of it anywhere, for it is your recompense for your service in the tent of meeting. So the Levites get this tithe. This is the Levitical tithe, and it's worth something. And of course, they don't just have to eat it in the tent of meeting. They can bring it home. You shall incur no guilt through it once you have removed the best part from it. You must not profane the sacred donation of the Israelites, lest you die. So this is a sacred gift. It's yours. You have to give a little over to God, but you can take it home with you. It's yours. Now, that's the end. What? No, it was offered up. It was offered up. Burned. It was burned up. It was burned up. So the Levites are supported. Now they don't get to do the hard, or no, they don't get to do the important part, the part of offering, making these offerings, but they do get to be supported, and they do have to, though, give their own tithe. Now, this is the part of the next portion. We're going to read a little bit today, so you can see what we're going to be reading next week. And we will be in person next week, which is the 17th. So here we go. Ready? This is an interesting one because as I title this, Holy Cow. Adonai spoke to Moses and Aaron saying, this is the ritual law that Adonai has commanded. Instruct the Israelite people to bring you a red cow without blemish, in which there is no defect, on which no yoke has been laid. You shall give it to Eleazar the priest. It shall be taken outside the camp and slaughtered in his presence. Eleazar shall take some of its blood with his finger and sprinkle it 7 times toward the front of the tent of meeting. And the cow shall be burned in his sight. Its hide, its flesh, blood shall be burned. Its dung included, everything. Burn the whole thing. And the priest shall take cedar wood, hyssop, and crimson stuff. Now, crimson stuff. What's the translation in the King James say, Mary?
Cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet.
Pretty much crimson, right? And Glory, what does your translation say for
Scarlet wool.
Yeah. We're not exactly sure what the red stuff looks like, but it's probably some kind of red garment or red thread, right? And throw them into a fire consuming the cow. So cedar wood obviously has a nice smell, but it's a special kind of wood. We know what that is. The hyssop also is some type of branches. The hyssop, which maybe also has a nice smell. Crimson stuff, we don't know what that would smell like, but it maybe seems to be connected to the red cow in the first place. The priest shall wash his garment and bathe his body in water. After that, the priest may re-enter the camp, but he shall be impure until evening. And the one who performed the burning shall also wash those garments in water, bathe in water, and is impure until evening. Another party who is pure shall gather up the ashes of the cow and deposit them outside the camp in a pure place, to be kept for the water of lustration. For the Israelite community, it is for purgation. I think we're going to finish off there, but let's explain what just happened. A red cow, it's a perfectly red cow, perfect, without blemish. It's taken out, it's burned up, and it's burned up with this other wood and red stuff, and it's burned up. And the ashes are kept in a special place. And again, the note here for water of lustration, for the water of impurity. Lori, what does your translation say? For in verse 9, the water of Nida.
For use in the water of cleansing.
Cleansing, yeah, pretty close. And Mary, yours says,
It is a purification.
Yep, purification. The word is nida, which is the same word that we use for someone who has been menstruating. We call that a period of nida. It is going to be used to cleanse people. Now, what's weird about it, of course, is that we burned a cow to get it. It's ashes. Doesn't seem like you'd use it to clean something.
Have you ever seen a red cow? I have not.
You have not, because it's very, very rare. And because you're not supposed to see a red cow. You're not supposed to see a red cow because this isn't something that you should ever really have to have. But of course, you need to have a cow, and it's a special cow. And this red heifer, as we call it the law of the red heifer, becomes something very, very important, which is that if you ever get into a situation where you need to purify people, you need to have the red heifer. And what's so important about this, folks? Here's the red heifer. I'll show you a red heifer. We are trying to, not we, but there are people
Oh,
that are trying to grow this red heifer.
yes.
This cow, if it can ever be perfect, we would take that cow, Jesse.
We just lost.
Were those
Told you it was Jewish.
Oh, my God.
What?
Faith,
Yeah,
something.
Yes, yeah. For the sota, right? So when you use ashes for something, for water purification, that this will somehow purify and make everything okay. Now, why is this so important? Because we can't have the third temple until we get this red heifer. So now we have people that are trying to make the red heifer. If you want to read a Wall Street Journal article, or I think they even did a 60 Minutes about making a red heifer. We are trying to genetically engineer this red heifer right now. It's actually the premise for a book called The Yiddish Policeman's Union that came out a few years ago. They were supposed to be making a movie of it. The Coen brothers were supposed to be making a movie of it. It's a Michael Chabon book that was about an alternate universe, by the way, Mike, where John, where Israel is never established and Jews live in Alaska. There is a Holocaust. A lot of Jews die, and the remnant live in Alaska. And there's a Jewish
We'd be rich.
police. Well, they don't seem to be that rich in the story. But anyways, it's an interesting book. And again, they were supposed to turn it into a movie, but it was about the restoration of the Jewish people with the Messiah and a red heifer. There have been other stories about the red heifer. There was a TV show that came out a few years ago called The Dig, which was about the rebuilding of the third temple and Christians and Jews working together to try to create a red heifer. It didn't do very well, the TV show The Dig, but it was also about creating this red heifer. So again, this is the red heifer, the unblemished pure red heifer, which we need to have. We can't have the temple until we have this thing to create. So there are a lot of people that are spending a lot of money trying to make this red cow come into existence. And then once we burn it, then we can purify and make a new level of priests, a new line of priests, and a new temple. So this red cow, people that are working on it right now, at this very moment. So this is a piece of Torah that you think is not very important, but yet is. And what do we learn? Folks, we don't know why the Torah tells us to do this. The rabbis actually tell us there are laws in the Torah that make absolutely no sense. And one of them is this one right here. Chukat HaTorah. Chok. This is what is called a Torah law that we have no rational explanation for. We don't know why. And the rabbis say in some cases we have those. And the most famous one is the law of the red heifer. Whenever they want to pull out, the rabbis want to pull out something that we just don't understand. This is it. They just don't know. We don't know. There's the Torah tells us, and so we do it. And so this is the example of one where they say this kind of defies rational explanation. But they understood that if we needed to have this, and we could have this, and they did have this, that this would purify the priests, and they could use it. So we call this the name of this Torah portion is called Hukat, which is the word for this law. It literally means any kind of law is called a Hukat. This is the Hukat HaTorah. This is a commandment. And so, was it done? Well, we assume it was done at some point. But more importantly, there are people that are actively trying to do this right now. So, next week, we're going to continue with this Torah portion. This Torah portion is known for this, or at least the name of it is, because of this law. But what this law, this Torah portion is really, really known for. What is really known for is something that we're going to read next week, which is Miriam dies. Now, what happens here, folks, is that 30 years passed and we never see it happen. Miriam dies, which tells us that we're now in a new generation. Now you're sitting there going, well, wait, what did I miss something?
So detailed, a lot of it, and some of it they skip over.
Skipped over 38 years.
And then the next slide again. These, it's most of the time.
Yeah, we'll read that part, but that's the new generation. And so what's interesting about this is that the Torah does not tell us anything about the journey, does not tell us anything about that 38 years, 40, almost 40 years in the wilderness. We just don't know about it. It's not there. It's not there. You just saw it. Well, you didn't see it, but you'll see it next week. But I just started you out on the beginning of chapter chapter 19. And they're not talking about what happened with the people. We're talking about a red cow. And then 38 years pass. So I will tell you, it is interesting, as you just said, John, what is in the Torah and also what is not in the Torah. And what we have to kind of imagine or kind of fill in the blanks on. But what we're left with is obviously the parts that are at least our ancestors, but they didn't dwell on it.
This one died, that one died.
I don't know, but what happened?
You have to be of Exodus,
Yep,
then you have the.
yep. You have 2 years of yeah,
Right?
yeah. And no time passes then. No time passes then.
And
The
now
entire,
40 years and stuff.
there's nothing there. So this is why the Torah is so interesting, because what you really see is it's not a history. It's not teaching us really what happened. We have to kind of fill in the blanks. That's what Midrash is for. That's what our imagination is for.
Rabbis employed for this.
Well, it definitely leaves us with lots of questions, but you know, we have to kind of imagine it. And by the way,
But
If-
not really. Rabbis were employed to be the-
to some extent, and they're, yeah, I mean, we would say today that that's kind of what rabbis do, but yes, teaching these stories or writing the Midrash or doing those kind of things was not what most rabbis throughout time have been. You're absolutely right. They were not what was, but they were the ones who did it. But the reality is that when we think about our lives and we sum up our lives, there are whole decades that we just don't even, like, we don't, I mean, listen, I know this because I talk to people, you know, I had a funeral today, you know, I talk to people about their lives or their families' lives. And you know, I try to figure out, like, I try to understand people's lives, right? I try to understand their Torah. And we'll talk about it a little bit, maybe a little bit more next week, but what does this teach us? Because oftentimes when we talk about our lives, you know, we talk about big events or we talk about things that were really good or really bad. And then the time in between, we don't talk about it, but it's really important. It makes us what we are, right? I mean, to some extent, I mean, it's the time in between that it's the time that we lived. But, you know, when somebody's going to sum up, hey, they were born here, this is where they went to school, this is where they got married, this is when they had kids, this is when, you know, there'll be like 5 or 6 things where you go, this is what they did. But of course, your life is so much more than those events, right? It's so much more than the things that people would say. Like if somebody said to you, now tell me about your life, you're probably gonna hit a couple points, but you're not gonna talk about what you did last Wednesday when you went out to I stopped in the Starbucks. And you start telling people are like, so what? Because people are like, well, did something really big happen? Did you see a shooting? Did somebody, nobody talks about those. Nobody talks about the average day. And so what happened during those 38 years? I don't know, but we can imagine that the average day was probably not so great. And
Like a cartoon.
well, look, you say that, and we're just joking about Curb Your Enthusiasm, but the funny thing is about that show, and I always joked about Seinfeld, was it was a show about nothing. There's nothing there. It was like, well, how do you describe it? Well, they went out to lunch and they went out to, there's nothing. There's not about anything dramatic. There's nothing dramatic that happens. It's the stupidity of life. And what's funny about that is that like most people don't deal with that. So, look, if you can deal with it and you can pull out some funny stuff about just an average ordinary day, that's actually kind of cool. That's actually kind of funny because that's most of our life. Most of our life are not the dramatic, things where, there's a fire and there's whatever, most of our life is not that. I hope not. But it's when you pull out the little things of an ordinary day and go, yeah, that's absurd, or that's funny, or I learned from that. That's kind of cool. So anyways, all I'm telling you is we'll see it next week. We're going to see a jump and you'll be like, what happened? When are we? And that's the last 10 chapters of Numbers from about chapter 19 till the end. It's the next generation. It's Moses and Aaron, because Miriam dies. It's Moses and Aaron hanging out with the people for the last couple of months of their lives. All right, folks, we will see you next week in person, and hopefully everyone will have a good couple of days in the meantime. And let's hope that there's not going to be problems in Israel over the next few weeks, because I will tell you, people are very excited about going to Israel, including the Kales, and we want them to not be worried about what's going to happen over the next few days. So let's hope that whatever happens in the next few days will not be bad. So take care, everybody.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.